The morning of June 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship, the newly commissioned carrier Taiho, as it steamed through the Philippine Sea. Around him, 9 Japanese aircraft carriers formed the largest carrier force the Imperial Japanese Navy had assembled in 2 years. To the east, somewhere beyond the horizon, lay the American Fast Carrier Task Force. Ozawa knew what waited there. What he could not have known, what perhaps no Japanese admiral truly grasped until it was far too late, was that he was not facing a fleet. He was facing a foundry. The numbers themselves told a story that Japanese naval intelligence struggled to believe. By mid-1944, American shipyards had commissioned 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, with more sliding down the ways every few months. The USS Franklin had been built in just 14 months. Yorktown, a ship displacing over 27,000 tons, had taken only 16.5 months from keel laying to commissioning. These were not the construction times of desperate improvisation. They were the product of methodical industrial planning that had begun years before Pearl Harbor, when the first Essex keels were laid in 1941. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For the Japanese admirals who had prosecuted the early war with such devastating effect, this reality represented something beyond mere tactical disadvantage. It was a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of their enemy. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, he had understood American industrial capacity in the abstract. He had studied at Harvard, toured American factories, and famously warned his government that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that he had no confidence in the outcome. What Yamamoto understood intellectually, however, the rest of the Imperial Japanese Navy's leadership had failed to internalize. They had believed that sinking American carriers at Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea, at Midway would leave the Pacific open for Japanese operations. They had not truly comprehended that for every carrier they sank, 3 more were already under construction. The Essex-class program itself was a monument to American industrial methodology. 32 carriers had been ordered, though wartime priorities and Japan's eventual collapse would render 6 of them unnecessary before construction even began. 24 were actually built. Of these, 17 saw combat service during World War II. The shipyards that built them, Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Norfolk, Braintree, operated around the clock. Welders, riveters, and pipe fitters worked in shifts that never stopped. The carriers themselves were designed with mass production in mind. Large expanses of flat steel surfaces meant that hull sections could be prefabricated and assembled with relative speed. The ships shared standardized components, standardized systems, standardized everything that could be standardized without compromising combat effectiveness. By the time Ozawa sorted for the Philippine Sea, the strategic arithmetic had become impossible to ignore. Japan had entered the war with 6 large fleet carriers. By mid-1942, after the disaster at Midway, 4 of those were at the bottom of the Pacific. The survivors, Zuikaku and Shokaku, had been joined by newly completed ships, bringing Japan's total carrier strength to 9 by June 1944. 9 carriers representing the absolute maximum effort of Japanese naval aviation, with air crews hastily trained to replace the superb pilots lost in earlier battles. Against them, the Americans deployed 15 fleet carriers in the Fast Carrier Task Force alone, not counting the light carriers and the escort, carriers that proliferated across every theater of operations. The doctrine that governed Japanese naval thinking since the Meiji era had always emphasized the decisive battle, the single engagement where superior spirit, superior training, and superior tactics would overcome material disadvantage. This was the ghost of Tsushima Strait, where Admiral Togo had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in 1905. Japanese naval officers studied that battle obsessively. They internalized its lessons about concentration of force, about timing, about the moral effect of the offensive. What they had not studied, what perhaps they could not study, was how to fight an enemy whose shipyards could absorb losses that would cripple any other nation and still grow stronger. When Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had authorized Plan A Go in May 1944, he had been operating under assumptions that were already obsolete. The plan called for a decisive carrier engagement in the Philippine Sea, supported by land-based aircraft from bases in the Marianas. Japanese planners estimated they would face a roughly equal force of American carriers. They assumed that Japanese aircraft, with their superior range, could strike first. They believed that land-based air power would attrit American carrier strength before the fleets even engaged. Every one of these assumptions was either incorrect or irrelevant, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of American industrial production. The psychological dimension of this mismatch was perhaps even more devastating than the material one. Japanese naval officers had been raised in a culture that valorized spirit over material, that taught that willpower and dedication could overcome technological or numerical disadvantage. The early victories of the war, Pearl Harbor, the rampage through the Dutch East Indies, the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse, had seemed to validate this worldview. But spirit could not weld hull plates. Bushido could not train replacement pilots faster than the Americans, who had developed a systematic rotation system that allowed experienced aviators to return to the United States to train new squadrons, passing on hard-won lessons from combat. The Japanese system kept pilots in combat until they were killed, then sent raw replacements to the front. It was spiritually pure and tactically suicidal. By June 1944, Admiral Ozawa commanded a fleet that looked formidable on paper. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 heavy cruisers, nearly 500 aircraft. But the aircraft were a mix of obsolete and modern types, and the pilots flying them averaged less than 6 months of training. Across from him, Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 deployed 15 fleet carriers and over 900 aircraft flown by pilots who had, on average, over 2 years of training and increasingly combat experience. The American carriers operated in task groups that had been refined through years of trial and error. They had integrated fighter direction centers that could vector interceptors to incoming raids with deadly precision. They had developed underway replenishment to a degree that Japanese logistics had never approached, allowing American carriers to remain at sea for months at a time. The gulf between these two fleets was not merely technological or numerical, it was philosophical. The Americans had embraced carrier warfare as a system, treating aircraft carriers not as floating battleships, but as mobile air bases requiring constant support, constant replenishment, constant coordination with other elements of the fleet. The Japanese had accepted carrier aviation intellectually, but never emotionally, always reserving final faith in the battleship and the decisive gun engagement. Even as Ozawa steamed toward the Philippine Sea, the mighty battleships Yamato and Musashi accompanied his force, embodiments of a doctrine that no longer matched the realities of naval warfare. What would happen in the next 2 days would be called the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot by American pilots. But that nickname, with its overtones of sport and ease, obscures the human tragedy that unfolded. Hundreds of young Japanese pilots, barely trained, climbed into their cockpits knowing they faced overwhelming odds. Many had been told their sacrifice would allow the surface fleet to close with the Americans and win the decisive battle that Japanese doctrine demanded. They flew to their deaths in waves, cut down by American fighters that had every advantage: better aircraft, better training, better radar direction, better tactics. Of the 373 carrier aircraft that Ozawa launched on June 19th, 243 were lost. The carriers Taiho and Shokaku were sunk by American submarines. Ozawa's carefully husbanded carrier strength was gutted in a single day. And still, the Essex-class carriers kept coming. Throughout the summer and fall of 1944, new carriers joined the fleet. USS Bonhomme Richard in November. USS Antietam would follow, though too late for combat service in World War II. The construction never stopped. The industrial base that produced these ships operated on a scale that Japan simply could not match. American steel production in 1944 exceeded that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American shipyard workers numbered in the hundreds of thousands, supported by a logistics network that spanned the continent. Japanese shipyards, by contrast, struggled with material shortages, competed with the army for resources, and operated under constant threat of American air attack. The mechanism through which Japanese naval intelligence tracked American carrier construction was both sophisticated and fundamentally inadequate. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained an extensive network of attachés, observers, and intelligence, analysts who monitored American naval publications, photographed ships under construction from international waters, and attempted to piece together the scale of American shipbuilding from fragmentary evidence. What they discovered should have been alarming. What they reported was consistently dismissed or minimized by senior leadership, who could not reconcile the numbers with their understanding of how naval warfare worked. In the spring of 1943, Japanese intelligence officers compiled reports indicating that the United States had at least 15 Essex-class carriers either completed, fitting out, or under construction. The analysis was accurate. The response from Combined Fleet Headquarters was skepticism. How could the Americans build so many fleet carriers so quickly? Japanese carrier construction times averaged 30 to 32 months from keel laying to commissioning. The Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, had taken 32 months to complete. Yet American intelligence suggested the Essex-class ships were being completed in half that time. The numbers seemed impossible, a product of either American disinformation or analytical error by Japanese intelligence officers. What Japanese analysts failed to understand was the revolution in American shipbuilding methodology that had occurred between 1939 and 1943. The Maritime Commission and the Navy Department had together developed mass production techniques that treated warship construction like automobile manufacturing. Hulls were built in sections that could be assembled rapidly. Electrical systems, piping, ventilation, all were standardized across the class, allowing workers to develop expertise that accelerated construction with each successive ship. The first Essex, CV-9, was commissioned on December 31, 1942, after 20 months of construction. By the time USS Franklin, CV-13, slid down the ways, Newport News, shipbuilding had cut construction time to 14 months. This was not corner cutting. Franklin would go on to survive multiple kamikaze hits, testimony to the structural integrity of her construction. The Japanese shipbuilding industry operated under constraints that American yards never faced. Steel allocation was controlled by the Army, which prioritized land-based weapons and the construction of merchant ships to replace catastrophic losses to American submarines. The Naval General Staff competed for resources with little success. Japanese carriers under construction in 1944 sat incomplete for months while waiting for steel deliveries, armor plate, or turbines that were diverted to other projects. The carrier Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, exemplified the problem. Despite being built in Japan's premier naval yard at Yokosuka, with priority access to materials, Shinano took over 3 years from the decision to convert her until commissioning in November 1944. She was sunk by the American submarine USS Archerfish 10 days later, never having embarked a full air group. By the autumn of 1943, the disparity in carrier strength was becoming undeniable even to the most optimistic Japanese planners. American carriers had appeared in such numbers during the Gilbert Islands campaign that Japanese reconnaissance pilots reported formations that seemed impossible. 8, 9, 10 carriers operating together, with sufficient escorts and support ships to sustain operations indefinitely. These were not exaggerations. Task Force 50 had deployed 11 carriers for the assault on Tarawa in November 1943. More were coming. Every month brought reports of new commissioning ceremonies, new ships joining the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Minachi Koga, who had assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death in April 1943, understood the arithmetic. In a series of planning meetings throughout late 1943 and early 1944, Koga and his staff developed what became known as the Z Plan, a strategy that acknowledged Japanese carrier forces could not match American numbers and therefore must be employed in conjunction with land-based aircraft to achieve local superiority at the decisive point. The plan was realistic in its assessment of Japanese limitations. It was also completely dependent on assumptions about American operational patterns that proved incorrect. When Koga died in March 1944, his aircraft disappearing in a typhoon while flying between Palau and the Philippines, his successor Admiral Toyoda inherited a strategic situation that was already approaching desperation. The human cost of this industrial mismatch was measured not in ships, but in the young men who crewed them. Japanese naval aviation had begun the war with perhaps the finest carrier pilots in the world. The aircrew who struck Pearl Harbor, who ranged across the Indian Ocean, who fought at Coral Sea and Midway, represented years of rigorous training and selection. By mid-1944, that cadre was gone, not just reduced, effectively annihilated. The battles of 1942 and 43 had consumed them. The new pilots arriving at carrier squadrons in 1944 had received perhaps 6 months of training, sometimes less. They could take off and land. They could barely navigate. Combat tactics, formation flying, coordinated attacks, these skills that American pilots developed over 2 years of training were beyond most of the replacement pilots now manning Japanese carriers. The disparity in pilot quality intersected catastrophically with the material imbalance. Japanese aircraft in 1944 remained essentially the same types that had fought at Pearl Harbor. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, which had dominated early war combat, now faced the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a fighter designed specifically to counter the Zero's advantages. The Hellcat was heavier, more durable, carried more ammunition, and in the hands of a well-trained pilot, could match or exceed the Zero's maneuverability, despite the American fighter's greater weight. American pilots had learned to avoid dogfighting Zeros, and instead used dive and zoom tactics that exploited the Hellcat's superior speed and structural strength. Japanese pilots, inadequately trained and flying aircraft that offered minimal protection, died in numbers that mounted exponentially as 1944 progressed. The morning of June 19, 1944, began with Japanese search aircraft locating elements of Task Force 58, approximately 200 miles west of Saipan. Admiral Ozawa, aboard Taiho, immediately ordered a strike. At 7:30 a.m., the first wave of 69 aircraft launched from Japanese carriers, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, their pilots briefed to hit the American carriers before the enemy could react. It was the last time Japanese naval aviation would mount a coordinated multi-carrier strike in World War II. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. American radar detected the incoming raid, while the Japanese aircraft were still more than 150 miles out. Fighter directors aboard the carriers vectored F-6F Hellcats to intercept. The Americans had 250 fighters in the air before the Japanese strike arrived. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. Japanese pilots, many making their first combat flight, encountered a wall of Hellcats flown by veterans who had refined their tactics through months of combat. The American fighters tore through the Japanese formations, shooting down aircraft with methodical efficiency. Of the 69 aircraft in the first wave, only 27 survived to approach the American ships. Of those, anti-aircraft fire from the fleet destroyed more. A single bomb hit the battleship USS South Dakota, killing 27 men but causing no significant damage. Not one Japanese aircraft reached the American carriers. Ozawa launched 3 more strikes throughout the day. Each met the same fate. The second wave of 107 aircraft lost at least 70 before reaching the fleet. 6 managed to attack Montgomery's carrier group, scoring no hits. The third wave of 47 aircraft became disoriented, many landing at Guam where American fighters from the carriers destroyed them on the ground. The fourth wave turned back without engaging when search aircraft reported they had misidentified the location of the American carriers. By evening, Ozawa had launched 373 carrier aircraft. 243 did not return. The Americans lost 29 aircraft in combat, but the day's catastrophe extended beyond the air battle. At 9:30 a.m., the American submarine USS Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes at Taiho. One struck home, hitting the carrier forward on the starboard side. The damage appeared manageable. Taiho's armored flight deck had been designed to withstand precisely this kind of attack. The carrier continued operating, launching aircraft as if nothing had happened. What the crew did not realize was that the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel tanks and severed fuel lines. Gasoline vapor began filling the spaces below decks. A damage control officer, attempting to ventilate the ship, opened vents that spread the fumes throughout Taiho rather than exhausting them overboard. At 2:32 p.m., 6 hours after the torpedo hit, a spark from a generator ignited the fuel vapor. The explosion tore through Taiho's interior, breaking her back. She sank within hours, taking 1,650 officers and men with her, including her captain. Admiral Ozawa transferred his flag to the cruiser Haguro. 3 hours after Albacore torpedoed Taiho, the submarine USS Kavala found Shokaku, the veteran carrier that had survived Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and the Eastern Solomons. Kavala fired 6 torpedoes. 4 struck Shokaku along her length. Unlike Taiho, Shokaku had no armored flight deck. The torpedoes opened her hull to the sea. Aviation fuel ignited, setting off stored bombs and torpedoes. Explosions rippled through the ship. Her captain ordered abandon ship at 2 p.m. At 3 p.m., a final massive explosion broke Shokaku in half. She sank within minutes, taking 1,200 men down with her. By nightfall on June 19th, Ozawa had lost 2 fleet carriers and more than 2/3 of his strike aircraft, along with nearly 3,000 trained personnel pilots, air crews, and ship's companies whose experience could not be replaced. Across from him, Task Force 58 had suffered minimal damage. The carriers Essex, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hornet, Yorktown, and 8 others remained fully operational. They would continue operations the following day, launching a dusk strike against the retreating Japanese fleet that would sink one more carrier and damage others. The Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the moment when the cumulative effect of American industrial production translated into absolute tactical dominance. This was not about courage or fighting spirit. Japanese pilots had demonstrated both in abundance, flying into combat despite overwhelming odds. It was about the material reality that no amount of courage could overcome. American carriers, American aircraft, American radar, American pilot training, American logistics, every element of the American system was superior because it was backed by an industrial base that operated on a scale the Japanese had never imagined possible. In the aftermath, senior Japanese naval officers began confronting what they had spent 3 years avoiding, the inescapable reality that they were fighting an enemy whose material resources rendered victory impossible. Admiral Ozawa, in his post-battle reports, noted that American combat air patrol maintained constant strength regardless of how many Japanese aircraft were shot down, suggesting carrier aircraft reserves far beyond what Japanese planning had anticipated. Admiral Toyoda, receiving reports of the disaster from his headquarters in Japan, understood that Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force had effectively ceased to exist. The carriers that survived could no longer project power because they had no aircraft and no pilots to fly them. The weeks following the Philippine Sea battle revealed the full dimensions of Japanese naval aviation's collapse. Admiral Ozawa's remaining carriers, Zuikaku, Junyo, Hio, and the light carriers limped back to Japanese waters with skeletal air groups. The mobile fleet as an offensive instrument had been destroyed. What remained were ships without aircraft, a fleet in name only. Throughout July and August 1944, the Naval General Staff attempted to reconstitute carrier air groups, pulling pilots from training schools before they had completed even the abbreviated courses now considered adequate. The effort was futile. The industrial base that produced aircraft could not keep pace with losses. The training establishment could not produce competent pilots fast enough. Most critically, the fuel situation had become catastrophic. American submarines had severed Japan's oil supply lines from the Dutch East Indies. Carriers sat in port not because they lacked aircraft, but because there was insufficient fuel oil to operate them. The strategic consequences cascaded throughout the summer of 1944. With Japanese carriers neutralized, American forces could operate with near impunity. In September, carrier strikes ranged across the Philippines, destroying hundreds of land-based aircraft and cutting the islands off from reinforcement. When American forces landed on Leyte in October, the Japanese response, Operation Show Go, represented a final, desperate gamble. Admiral Ozawa's carriers, now carrying only 116 aircraft among 4 carriers, were assigned the role of decoy. Their mission was not to fight but simply to be seen, to draw Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet away from the Leyte beachhead so that Japanese surface forces could attack the vulnerable invasion transports. The plan worked tactically. Halsey took the bait, but the strategic result was the destruction of Japan's remaining carrier force. On October 25, 1944, American carrier aircraft from Task Group 38.3 sank all 4 Japanese carriers off Cape Engano. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force, rolled over and sank at 2:14 p.m., her ensign lowered minutes before. With her went the institutional memory of Japanese carrier warfare. The human toll of this collapse extended far beyond the pilots and sailors who died in combat. Thousands of young men continued reporting to air stations throughout late 1944 and into 1945 for training that everyone involved understood was inadequate. They learned basic flight skills knowing they would likely die in their first combat sortie. Many never reached that point. By early 1945, fuel shortages meant that student pilots received perhaps 30 hours of flight time before being assigned to operational units. Some were sent directly to kamikaze squadrons, where minimal flight training sufficed because the mission required only the ability to fly an aircraft into a ship. The kamikaze program itself represented the ultimate admission that Japan could not match American material superiority. If Japanese pilots could not survive combat long enough to become effective, if Japanese aircraft couldn't penetrate American defenses, then the logical endpoint was to turn the pilot and his aircraft into a guided missile. It was rational within the context of absolute material inferiority, and it was an atrocity committed by the Japanese leadership against its own young men. American carrier construction continued unabated through the end of the war. USS Boxer, CV-21, commissioned in April 1945. USS Bon Homme Richard in November 1944 had been followed by USS Leyte, CV-32, in April 1946, too late for combat, but proof that the production line continued operating even after victory was assured. Of the 24 Essex-class carriers eventually completed, several never saw combat because the war ended before they could be deployed. This was the ultimate measure of American industrial capacity building, ships faster than they could be needed, maintaining production schedules that continued past the point of military necessity, because the industrial machine, once set in motion, operated according to its own logic. The Japanese admirals who survived the war confronted their miscalculations in post-war interrogations conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Admiral Ozawa, questioned extensively about the Battle of the Philippine Sea, acknowledged that Japanese naval aviation had been decisively defeated not in combat, but in the industrial war that preceded combat. When asked whether he believed Japan could have won the carrier war given different tactical decisions, Ozawa was blunt. The material disparity was so overwhelming that no tactical brilliance could have compensated. Admiral Toyoda, interrogated about his strategic decisions, made similar admissions. The Japanese had understood intellectually that America possessed superior industrial capacity. What they had failed to grasp was how that capacity would translate into operational dominance. They had imagined American production as a potential threat to be neutralized through early victories. They had not imagined it as an inexorable force that would render Japanese naval aviation obsolete within 2 years of Pearl Harbor. The legacy of this industrial mismatch shaped post-war naval thinking in ways that remain relevant decades later. The Essex-class carriers themselves continued serving long after World War II ended. Many were modernized repeatedly, given angled flight decks, steam catapults, updated radar and electronics serving through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, into the 1970s. USS Lexington, CV-16, operated as a training carrier until 1991, 50 years after her keel was laid. 4 Essex-class carriers are preserved as museum ships today: Yorktown at Charleston, Intrepid in New York, Hornet at Alameda, and Lexington at Corpus Christi. Walking their hangar decks, standing on their flight decks, visitors can see the industrial artifact that destroyed Japanese naval power, not through any single battle, but through the cumulative effect of systematic, methodical mass production applied to warship construction. The question that haunts any examination of the Pacific Carrier War is whether Japanese leadership could have made different choices that would have altered the outcome. The answer, based on the industrial realities of 1943 and 1944, is almost certainly no. Japan's national industrial production in 1944 totaled approximately $15 billion in contemporary terms. American industrial production in the same year exceeded $200 billion. This was not a gap that could be bridged through superior tactics, better training, or more determined fighting spirit. It was an existential disparity that made Japanese defeat inevitable once the American production base mobilized for war. But understanding the inevitability of defeat does not absolve Japanese leadership of responsibility for how the defeat unfolded. The decision to launch the Pacific War in December 1941 was made by men who understood they were gambling on American unwillingness to prosecute a long war rather than American inability to win one. Admiral Yamamoto's famous statement about running wild for 6 months to a year was both prescient and ignored by the political leadership that ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. When those 6 months expired and America had not sued for peace, Japanese strategy had no coherent answer. The result was a grinding attrition campaign that Japan could not win, fought by young men who were sent into combat with inadequate training, inadequate equipment, and no realistic possibility of victory. The men who flew from Ozawa's carriers on June 19, 1944, deserved better from their leadership. They had been told they were fighting for their country's survival, which was true. They had been told their sacrifice would matter, which was not. The institutional dishonesty that characterized Japanese military leadership, the refusal to acknowledge defeat, the insistence on continued sacrifice long after victory became impossible, the willingness to expend lives rather than admit error transformed military defeat into moral catastrophe. The Kamikaze program, which began in October 1944 as a direct response to the carrier aviation collapse at Philippine Sea, represented this moral bankruptcy in its purest form. It was dressed in the language of samurai tradition and voluntary sacrifice, but the reality was that young men with minimal training were sent to die because their leadership had no other options remaining, and refused to acknowledge that continuing the war served no purpose except to prolong suffering. American industrial capacity, embodied in the Essex-class carriers, was not simply a matter of shipyards and steel mills. It represented a different approach to warfare, one that emphasized logistics over élan, systematic planning over improvisational brilliance, industrial capacity over warrior spirit. The American military in World War II was often criticized by its own officers and by subsequent historians for being too methodical, too cautious, too reliant on material superiority rather than tactical innovation. There is truth to these criticisms. American commanders in the Pacific could afford to be cautious because they knew that losing a carrier to Japanese attack was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. Replacements were already at sea or under construction. This knowledge shaped operational planning in ways both positive and negative. It allowed sustained campaigns that ground down Japanese defenders through sheer material weight. It also sometimes led to unnecessary caution when aggressive action might have shortened the war. The Japanese understanding of American production capacity, fragmentary and incomplete as it was, played a crucial role in the decision to escalate kamikaze tactics in the war's final year. If conventional air attacks could not penetrate American defenses, if pilot training had degraded to the point where most Japanese aviators died without inflicting damage, then suicide attacks represented a grim, rational calculation. One aircraft, one pilot, one bomb aimed directly at an American ship with the pilot guiding it to impact. The success rate of kamikaze attacks, measured in ships damaged or sunk per sortie, exceeded that of conventional bombing. This was not a moral argument for the tactic. It was simply the arithmetic of desperation, the mathematics that emerge when one side possesses overwhelming material superiority and the other side has no weapons remaining except the willingness of its young men to die. In the end, the story of Japanese admirals confronting American carrier production is not primarily a story about ships or battles. It is a story about the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare and, more broadly, to industrialized society itself. The Japanese military leadership of the 1930s and 40s had been formed in a cultural tradition that valorized individual excellence, spiritual strength, and the warrior ethos. These were not contemptible values. They produced men of remarkable courage and dedication. But courage and dedication proved insufficient when confronted by an enemy that treated warfare as an industrial problem requiring industrial solutions. The Essex-class carriers were not better ships than Japanese carriers in any absolute sense. Taiho, with her armored flight deck and reinforced hull, represented sophisticated naval architecture. Shokaku and Zuikaku were excellent ships that had proven their worth in battle after battle. But Japanese shipyards built carriers one at a time, craft production methods applied to warship construction. American shipyards built carriers the way Ford built automobiles, standardized designs, prefabricated components, assembly line methods adapted to 30,000-ton warships. The cultural assumption behind this approach was that warfare in the industrial age was fundamentally about production capacity, about the ability to build weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. This assumption proved correct. The human cost of proving it correct was measured in hundreds of thousands of lives, American sailors and pilots killed in combat, Japanese pilots sent to die in aircraft they barely knew how to fly, Japanese sailors manning ships that had become floating coffins, and ultimately, the civilians of Japan who died in the firebombing campaigns and atomic attacks that ended the war. The industrial capacity that built Essex-class carriers in 16 months also built the B-29 Superfortress bombers that burned Japanese cities. It was all the same industrial base, all the same systematic approach to warfare as production problem. Efficient, methodical, and ultimately devastating in its application. Today, when we examine the Pacific Carrier War from the perspective of 8 decades, the industrial mismatch seems obvious. The numbers were public. American newspapers reported carrier launchings. Japanese intelligence could count the ships under construction in American yards. But numbers on paper do not convey experiential reality. Japanese admirals who had commanded carriers in battle, who understood the complexity of carrier operations, who knew the years of training required to produce competent carrier pilots, could not quite believe that the Americans were building carriers the way they built merchant ships. The cognitive dissonance between what they knew about carrier construction from their own experience and what American production figures indicated created a gap in understanding that persisted until reality forced recognition. By then, it was far too late. The irony embedded in the title about Japanese admirals not believing American carrier production is that by mid-1944, belief was irrelevant. The carriers existed. They operated off Saipan, off the Philippines, off Iwo Jima, off Okinawa, and finally off the Japanese home islands themselves. Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hancock. Bennington, the names march through the operational histories like a roll call of American industrial capacity made manifest. They were there because American shipyards could build them faster than Japanese forces could sink them. That simple fact, more than any battle or tactical innovation, decided the Pacific War's outcome. The admirals who commanded them knew it. The admirals who opposed them learned it. And the young men who died on both sides paid the price for the time it took that knowledge to become undeniable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.